have to get to her eventually. Now, Bearn's story actually starts before World War I as the last of the Normandy-class battleships to be laid down. The others all began work in 1913, but she was laid down in early 1914. All work on the class was stopped for the duration of World War I, and in the post-war environment, various ideas were circulated on completing the first 4 ships, which were more advanced in their construction, but for various reasons, these all ended up going nowhere. Bearn, as the least complete, remained unaffected by these ideas, sitting as a partially complete hull that had been launched in spring 1920 just to clear the slipway. Around the same time, a group of French naval officers were given a tour of the recently completed carrier HMS Argus, as well as drawings of HMS Eagle, which was still undergoing conversion at that stage. This led to the idea of converting one of the Normandies into a carrier, and Bearn was chosen to trial a few ideas out, as it would involve relatively little work. These tests used a temporary wooden flight deck placed atop the half-completed hull, and were relatively successful, but for the next 2 years the idea languished until the Washington Naval Treaty came along, which somewhat forced the Marine Nationale's hand. Since she was still the least complete of the 5 Normandies, it was decided to use Bearn as the basis for a carrier conversion, using material from her sister ships and some new parts to convert her into an aircraft carrier. Although substantially lightened, and with newer and more powerful boilers available, Bearn, in her brand new form, would struggle to exceed her originally planned battleship speed of 21 knots by more than half a knot or so, largely because a significant amount of her former machinery spaces were now occupied with fuel, bombs, and spare parts for her air group. This would make her the slowest of the capital ship carrier conversions of the 1920s by quite some margin. She was also given a combined power plant with vertical triple expansion engines for cruising on the outer shafts and turbines for full speed running on the inner shafts. All of this was supplied by 40,000 CV, or metric horsepower. The boilers were trunked out to the starboard in a rather massive blister that fed an equally massive funnel, which was fronted by a slimlined island. The blister was actually to intake cold air to reduce the amount of turbulence generated by funnel gases. When she wasn't operating aircraft, 2 masts and a 4-deck tall chart house would pop up out of the flight deck in order to make navigation of the ship easier. Armour would consist of a rather tall 3.3-inch thick belt and a 1-inch turtle-back deck, and unusually, the coal bunkers, which had been designed for her original battleship power plant, were retained despite the ship now being oil-fired, as it was thought that the coal running down each side would provide a degree of protection against shells and torpedoes in addition to the armour plate, and in the case of flooding, it would provide a bit of buoyancy. The air group was initially planned to be 32, with 8 fighters and 2 squadrons of 12 recon aircraft each. This cast the ship's role not as a strike vessel, but rather as a fleet recon asset, with a small amount of defence against similar intruding enemy aircraft. She also carried 8 6-inch guns in 4 sets of paired casements at the 4 corners of the ship, along with 4 above-water torpedo tubes, although in the original design she was supposed to have 12, 4 75mm, 8 37mm, and a dozen 8mm guns completed the dedicated anti-aircraft battery, at least as initially designed. The flight group lived in a large double-height hangar. The upper hangar was for operational aircraft, and the lower one was for repairing broken ones and stores. This was all topped by a single flight deck that ran the length of the ship. Initially, the aft end of the flight deck was heavily angled down at 10 degrees to help with the landing, but following trials and a decision to allow landing over the bow, a pair of refits saw both ends of the flight deck modified. The bow end was given a 4.5 degree downslope and the aft end was raised to match. 1 small and 2 large lifts were installed, with the larger amidships and aft lifts given very large clamshell doors to allow the flight deck to be used while the lifts were still making their way up and down. Upon entering service in 1928, one of the reconnaissance squadrons was changed to a torpedo bomber squadron, and during the interwar period she would actually play host to the first twin-engine aircraft to fly from a carrier, a Potez 565 transport. However, Early operations showed that she had a long list of issues, including the fact her boilers didn't work properly, and the lack of high speed and the somewhat glacial nature of the lifts meant that in one exercise she broke off from the fleet to land just 2 aircraft. Meanwhile, the fleet steamed along at a rather stately 12 knots, and it then took her 1.5 hours to catch up with them again. Big plans were made to try and change this and improve other areas as well, like torpedo defense, but the cost compared to the hull's age meant that only a smaller refit was ordered. She had some new boilers, the chart house was removed along with the torpedo tubes, and some heavier machine guns were installed in place of the original lightweight ones, along with some new anti-aircraft fire control equipment. Most of the lessons learned during her operation, along with some of the money that would have otherwise gone into this refit, would then be incorporated into the upcoming Joffre-class carriers. However, once back in service, she remained far too slow to do anything but accompany the older Britannia-class battleships. The new interwar-built cruisers and the Dunkirks would leave her in the dust. And so, pending the arrival of a new air group, she was reduced to a training role. She was in this role as World War II continued to go from bad to worse for the French, and she was sent with a cargo of gold to the USA in order to buy and ship back military equipment. She was on her way back when news of the fall of France reached the ship and her escorts, and they diverted to Martinique in the Caribbean. Here, she was eventually immobilized and stripped for parts, which was just in time for the French Caribbean colonies to join the Free French forces. After a failed attempt to refit her, she was converted to an aircraft transport in the USA, replacing her guns with US dual-purpose and anti-aircraft weapons and fire control. She then re-entered service in February 1945, with her speed having fallen to around 18 knots. Her bad luck continued, though. She only managed one voyage during the war as she briefly lost power and collided with a troopship during it. After another refit, now post-war, she was used as a transport to move supplies and equipment to French Indochina in the approximate predecessor to the Vietnam War. Then, in 1948, she was assigned as a submarine tender back in France, which is where she remained for almost 2 decades until being scrapped in the late 1960s, having never deployed an aircraft in anger.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.